I'm going to go ahead and get started then. Amazing. First of all, thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, of course.
You're traveling all the time. You're really
Yeah, I'm going to Culebra today to work on the energy security story.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad for the work that you're doing. I saw that you were with Los Pleneros de la Cresta. Yeah. They're powerful. Like their voice is powerful. Their energy is powerful.
It's a crazy kind of serendipitous story on how we met. Yeah. I was here working on a story, kind of self-assigned story about the Puerto Rico elections, Puerto Rico gubernatorial elections, which was, I was in New York. Mm-hmm. I noticed that there was this massive election happening, this huge wave of independence energy happening, kind of pushed along by a mix of older independentistas and the younger generation. And I said, I think there's something here that we should pay attention to. Paid attention to it in the last election too, but Delma only got like a small percentage of the vote in the last election. And I came in September or October when they were doing the voter registration events across the island.
So you saw how all of that.
I saw how it was a big. Can I curse on this podcast? Okay. I saw how it was a complete clusterfuck. I learned pretty quickly about how a lot of it appeared to be deliberate. I had friends who went to the mall to register to vote, and there was a blackout, and they were there for 8 or 9 hours. I went and shot a voter registration event at Vivo Beach Club, which is actually where I shot Los Pleneros 2 nights ago. And PJ Sinsuela, who's an amazing story, who I really want to do a story on, as a practicing physician who's also a rapper who still goes out and to marginalized communities in Puerto Rico. So that's another story I have brewing, and I spoke to PJ about that on Saturday night, and his eyes lit up talking about medicine, which was really nice. So I was working on this story on the voter registration issues. An organization called Prende Tu Voto was organizing a voter registration event at Vivo Beach Club, and there was a big concert that evening, and all you had to do to get into this concert, Chewy was playing, a bunch of other great bands were playing, was show your voter registration card. But the authorities, obviously the Electoral Commission, which is dominated by the party in power, PNP, they only sent one voter registration machine, and literally between 800 and 1,000 people had signed up to come to this registration event. So people were waiting there for 8, 9, 10 hours on end, and you could see by the end of the night, it was 11, 12 at night, the concert was going on downstairs on the stage, and the voter registration booth upstairs was still open. And at that point, the story got even deeper to me. I pitched it to a lot of media outlets in up north in the States, and the response was, it's a great story. We didn't really know about this. We'd love to cover it, but we are inundated with U.S. election coverage. And also, the underlying message that I always got was, we don't really know how to cover Puerto Rico, because Puerto Rico is not, in their eyes, is not quite national news, because it's not technically a state. It's a territory, and it's kind of swept under the rug, or a colony. And it's also doesn't fall under international news, so we're not going to cover it in the international section. So Puerto Rico kind of exists in this weird liminal space for think tanks where I worked in DC, where we didn't know whether to cover it in our domestic policy arena or in our international Latin America policy arena, and for newspapers too. So that just kind of pushed me to keep doing the work, to get photo editors and news editors to keep to be a squeaky wheel, and it's helped a little bit. So I'm going to keep going.
Because I also had a friend during the elections working for the Democratic Party, and she was saying that she's born and raised here, and she said the same thing that you say. There's always this weird response not quite sure. We have other things that need to be more important, and yet it is so much a fabric of the U.S. culture to understand what they're doing in Puerto Rico. So I'm glad that you're pushing. She's pushing. We're all kind of trying to.
It's hard. I mean, they want to cover the much more of the surface level issues. Talk about the blackouts, the energy issues, the debt, but it's hard to find really deep investigative reporting from U.S. news outlets, think tanks, when it comes to the underlying issues, the foundational issues, the historical issues about Puerto Rico.
Do you feel that there's at least spaces here or some spaces that do cover? Because I think of Centro Investigativo de Periodismo. Sorry, I butchered that one. But like there are spaces here that cover it, but
right, there's great work being done here in Puerto Rico, but it doesn't get picked up outside of Puerto Rico. That's the problem. And I understand that, like I'm coming in here as, an American who grew up primarily in New York and New Jersey. Grew up coming down here my whole life because my grandparents had a place on the East Coast, and they bought it in 1979, 1980. So my entire childhood was coming back down here and spending a lot of time with them and spending a lot of time in the summer here. Over the course of my personal life, having relationships with people who are from Puerto Rico, living here for months at a time, started to get more and more involved and conscious of my relationship as an American from New York with Puerto Rico and my role in perpetuating the issues that Puerto Rico has. So that gets back to your question of, there's a lot of great work being done on Puerto Rico from the island by Puerto Ricans. And in my work, I'd like to kind of help be the rising tide that lifts all boats and bring these voices from Puerto Rico to New York, to Washington, D.C., to Silicon Valley, where, like what you're doing, where there's actually the possibility of having policy change. Puerto Ricans have been yelling and screaming and shouting and fighting for these changes for generations, but until in Washington or in the areas where there are large Puerto Rican populations from the diaspora or concerned citizens from the United States who want to take it upon themselves to push for change in Puerto Rico, then sadly it's not going to happen. There has to be buy-in from the decision makers in the U.S. government as well. So I think there's a lot of Americans who have the possibility to vote who, if they could, would push for change in Puerto Rico and this movement of self-determination along.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you for that. I was actually going to ask you, how did you create this bond with Puerto Rico? But interesting to hear about your childhood here. If you could just talk a little bit about a memory maybe that you have from when you were growing up that maybe has influenced why you decided to go into.
I wouldn't say it's one memory. I think it's just I think it's more about a history of a relationship with a place, and my relationship with Puerto Rico evolving. Puerto Rico always being in my mind as a child as, the place where I would visit my grandparents, where I would, go to the mountains and go to the beach and, eat the food I loved and come here for the holidays. And it was just a really positive association as a child. And I was kind of shielded from the outside issues that Puerto Rico was facing. I wasn't really made aware of it. My grandparents would talk about, some of the issues with me, and I was aware of a much more macro level of what was happening in Puerto Rico. But it wasn't until I started to develop personal relationships with Puerto Ricans, as a young adult and then as an adult, that I was able to really understand on a deeper level the issues that are occurring in Puerto Rico and the role of the U.S. government and the role of Americans in perpetuating these issues. And having studied anthropology and global health, I started to, be able to understand, sociologically what the issues are, and to be able to look at the issues of Puerto Rico through a more sociological lens, to understand what a call for independence means, to understand what a call for statehood would entail. And as I worked at a think tank for 5 years. I went to grad school for international relations. I worked at a think tank in Washington, D.C. called the Brookings Institution. I started to develop kind of more skills in order to be able to understand and research from a policy side. So it was kind of when I made the leap to, documentary photography and journalism full time, this became kind of the place that called to me to kind of help, tell its, not just its story, but stories. Every family has a deep history here. Every family has suffered and thrived in a uniquely Puerto Rican way. And getting to know friends and also getting to know their parents and their grandparents has been a really crucial part of understanding for me the issues of Puerto Rico on a personal and sociological level. And then I had a partner for about 3 or 4 years. We met in DC. She's from Puerto Rico. She had a job with the a federal agency in the States. She was doing like a graduate internship. And then Maria hit, and they offered her a full-time job. So she said, I might as well come stay. I might as well stay in DC. A lot of her family actually came and stayed with her because her family's house obviously lost power. Her grandparents had been on Vieques and had sheltered prominent members of the independence movement. And through her family and her family history, I really got to know on a deeper level the history of the independence movement. And then I started to, it was kind of an inside out. Usually people take a more academic approach and then they start to research from a more personal perspective. For me, it was inside out. I learned directly from families who had lived through it. And then I started to read more from the policy side. I started to read books. I started to listen to podcasts. And I started to get a deeper understanding of the history of it.
That's really beautiful. I was going to say that you did have that base, though, in sort of like your time at BU. We were just talking about how we both went to BU, but I think going to the School of Public Health was what kind of opened my mind first to the social issues and understanding social or environmental issues. And then getting to know those personal stories kind of like opened something you just wouldn't have expected.
And these personal stories, kind of like the public health and the policy stuff, you're looking at things from 30,000 feet from up in the sky, and it helps you understand what's happening on the ground level. But it's really hard to share and illuminate these issues in public health, in energy, which is the way I'm approaching this story with energy security, until you really get on the ground and you're without power for days. You experience it yourself, or you learn the stories and you help share the stories of people who have lived and are living through it. So that's kind of the way I approach all my work in Puerto Rico specifically.
That's a great segue. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about your photography, your journalism. How did you get into that to begin with?
It was always from the start, my goal with my career has been, as cliche as it sounds, is to create positive social impact in my community and any community that I feel like could use my specific helping hand. I grew up both a grandchild of Holocaust survivors, 4 refugees from the former Soviet Union and from Poland. My grandparents are survivors my dad's parents are survivors from Poland. My maternal grandparents, my mom's parents, who moved to Puerto Rico, their families fled from the Soviet Union and from pogroms in the Soviet Union. So those kind of family values. And then my parents' generation, my dad grew up very poor in Queens. He went on to become a doctor, went to Brooklyn College, downstate, became a doctor. My mom's parents, who are my background on my phone here, that's actually a photo of them in Puerto Rico on their old couch. I don't know if you can see it.
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. My grandmother went on, an immigrant in New York, 4'9", child of immigrants, the only female graduate of her entire medical school class in New York City, Flower, Manhattan. Yeah. And my grandfather was a physician too. And both of my mom's a photographer, but both of her siblings are doctors and married to doctors. And my dad is a doctor, and now my brother is a doctor, an emergency room physician, which is the most selfless specialty you can possibly pick, and that's why he picked. So these values of, we came from, my grandparents' generation struggled immensely. My parents' generation was able to thrive as first generation Americans, and I grew up, in a extremely privileged environment, growing up in New York and New Jersey. Never wanted for anything, always had power, roof over my head. But those values of, this is how close we are, your grandparents' generation, to losing everything, to coming and surviving, literally surviving, running for your lives and surviving, and given a new opportunity. And now we are on level footing and we're on solid ground. You have an opportunity. This is the lucky deck that life handed you. What are you going to do with that opportunity? And after I did my junior year of college, like I told you, I went and studied global health, culture and community in Tanzania and Vietnam with the International Honors Program. And I was figuring out at that point, there's not really much you could do with a degree in anthropology other than go into academia, go get a PhD. And I'm not a bookish person. I don't like being in libraries. I like being out in the field. So I started to think of what utility can I use, to most directly, help people. And I looked at the work of MSF, Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, and I said, okay, I want to go be a doctor so that I can go work for Doctors Without Borders. I did a post-bac for medical school after that. I took my MCATs. I did okay. I did fine. I went to medical school in the Caribbean. It was really hard. Yeah. I struggled a lot. I'm not a science person. I really fucking suck at science and math. My parents said, they're like, we support whatever you do, but you're not good at this. So why are you doing this? Try another way. And that made me want to do it more. I was stubborn and dumb and struggled, but I made it through the first semester. Second semester, I had a little motorcycle. I was on my way to class, slipped on some wet pavement, hit my head, had a bad head injury that I'd had concussions before from sports. I thought I'd get better in 2 weeks. 2 weeks passed. I didn't get better. I tried to go back. I couldn't focus. I started failing all my classes. My mood was terrible. Couldn't look at a computer screen for more than 5 minutes without getting a terrible migraine. And started to just get terrible migraines. So after 6 months, 7 months, 8 months, 9 months, a year went by, I realized that cognitively, my brain just wasn't in the place that I could handle medical school anymore. And I looked at it. I don't think, necessarily the universe. Yeah. I think I took a shitty situation and I swallowed my ego and I moved past it and tried to reorient myself and figure out, okay, how can I accomplish the things that I wanted to accomplish as a doctor through other means? So I worked for a bunch of small nonprofits, mainly in global health. I ran program development for a medical NGO called Global Medical Training, where we set up free medical clinics with American medical students and local doctors in the DR, Peru, Nicaragua, Panama, and India. And I went and started our programs in India and Peru. Some other programs that did education. That time period was 2 to 3 years. Then I worked in media because I wanted to basically figure out how to write and how to connect. I noticed that all these small nonprofits, their heads were in the right place, but they didn't know how to run themselves as a business. And I don't know how to do business, but I know how to communicate. So I said, and they also don't really know how to tell their own story. They don't know how to communicate. They don't know how to fundraise. So I went and I worked at a communications agency called VaynerMedia, got some experience. It was fun, but not my cup of tea. Made some money, went to grad school, kept working while I was in grad school, had the least amount of fun in the history of Miami. I went to University of Miami for grad school because I worked 2 jobs and finished my degree in a year. My University of Miami is amazing. I love it. I'm still on their advisory board, but all I did was work.
Okay.
But then I went and worked at Brookings in the, I got a graduate internship, and then they hired me full time afterwards. I worked for 4 or 5 years in the foreign policy department at Brookings. Struggled to get us to work on Puerto Rico because I was there in DC for, the Renuncia protests, and there were big protests in DC too that my ex-partner and I were a part of, but they didn't want to cover it because they didn't figure out where it could fit, and that kind of lit the fire of wanting to do more on Puerto Rico. And at the same time, COVID hit. So I started to go outside with my camera and with my phone. It was always my dream in the back of my head to be a documentary photographer.
What do you think kept you from that? What do you feel?
Failure, fear of failure, ego, misplaced expectations of myself.
Wouldn't know it from looking at your work, because anytime just watching what you've done, looking at what you've done.
I thought,
wow, amazing.
Thank you.
I really thought you'd been doing it for much longer than.
No, I mean I've been around cameras. My first my bar mitzvah gift from my grandparents was a camera. My mom's a photographer, so I've been around it. My mom, who is my harshest critic, is it's very hard for me to show my mom my photographs, but I have to because she'll be like, no. Okay, yes, but I would frame this different. No. But yeah, when I started to really take photography seriously, I thought my work was great. It actually fucking sucked. And I didn't realize it till I started to get around other photographers whose work was actually really good, my friends and colleagues. And now that I'm a quote-unquote professional, I see my work and I'm like, oh man, this fucking sucks. No. And it's probably better than I think it is, but yeah.
And I feel like, just coming from perspective of filmmaking, because I did the same thing. I was very interested in public health and trying to figure out social good. And then Maria hit, and that's when I got into podcasting. And then a few years later, I got into filmmaking. All because you want to connect art and activism, right? And trying to figure out that bridge.
And in Puerto Rico, those lines are either completely blurred or don't exist anymore. And I think maybe with what Benito did with his latest album, the rest of the world is starting to see that. If they actually listen to the lyrics, I think he's doing a great job of kind of forcing it upon people to not just listen to his music, but to hear what he's saying. He did the visualizers with Jorel Mendiz Badillo, the author from Wisconsin, who just wrote. His book is amazing. I really want to speak to him.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if anyone who's watching this interview, go check out that book. It's called Puerto Rico of a Nation. Yep.
Something like that. Yeah, Puerto Rico and National History, I think. Yeah. And I think it just came out in paperback. It's in Spanish and English.
And it's on Spotify.
It's on Spotify. I was listening to it on Spotify. Yeah.
Yeah, any history, but going back to what you were saying, right? How Bad Bunny's trying to bring people to an understanding, or at least to not look away.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because no one's in a survey, right? I'm thinking from the public health perspective of just Americans understanding the issue here. It's just, how they see it. Some people don't even know that the connection. Now I think that's changing, obviously, but
it's changing slowly. And I'll say even, friends of mine who know my work, who are, are quote unquote well-read or well-educated, are still asking me, so what's the deal with Puerto Rico? And what they mean by that is, do I need a passport to travel to Puerto Rico? Is Puerto Rico a state? Is it a territory? Oh, it's more like a colony. What do you mean it's a colony? Oh, what do you mean they can't vote in the U.S. general elections? Oh, what do you mean they don't have Democratic and Republican parties here? Oh, what do you mean the Jones Act? What do you mean Act 60? What do you mean Act 22? What do you mean all of, Luma is a private, energy company is in charge of the power? It just goes deeper and deeper and deeper, and people there's so much going on in the States that there's a limited, I hate using this term, but there's a limited even bandwidth or capacity for understanding the promises of Puerto Rico, because Americans in the States are so concerned with fighting the daily fight in their own lives that it's become even more difficult to care for them about Puerto Rico if they don't feel like they have skin in the game or a dog in the fight.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think there's skin in the game is a big piece of it. I wonder also if education is a piece of it, because even just the language of colonialism and all those things, like they don't even know where to.
We learn American history in the U.S. and you learn about it differently in different parts of the country. The Civil War is taught very differently in New York versus North Carolina, where I went to high school for a few years. And we talk about American history, we talk about, Columbus coming, and we talk about, the Native Americans and the Pilgrims and the Nina and the Pinta and the Santa Maria. Not once in my formal education was Puerto Rico mentioned, other than Spanish-American War. We won Puerto Rico in 1898 as a spoil of war, or Columbus spent a little bit of time here, or Ponce de Leon, but never once have we did we discuss in the American history curriculum, and any curriculum as far as I know, even in New York City where there's a huge diaspora, Puerto Rican community, they might have a little, vignette on leaders like, Marin, but, they sweep the more independent leaders under the rug a little bit more. You're not going to hear about Canales, you're not going to hear about Lebron, you're not going to hear about Albizu Campos unless a specific teacher decides that, they're going to take it upon themselves to teach their students about it.
And I think that's important to have Puerto Ricans that are active, that know their history, that go in there, or others that, because I have seen that. I have seen people say, no, I grew up with all that knowledge, all the history of the repression, understanding, but it's too far and few between. And obviously I think that's why we do these kinds of things and trying to educate people. I did have a question for you. I didn't want to forget this question because I'm very curious, as you're coming in to Puerto Rico, I know you're trying to be very nuanced in the way you portray. What is your approach, in terms of like what you're trying to capture when you're trying to capture either individuals or landscapes? Like, what's your process and what are you looking for when you're looking through the lens?
I think what I'm looking for is trying to keep in mind the one of the issues that one of the kind of journalistic issues that I'm trying to address in Puerto Rico is that there's a kind of colonial way of talking about Puerto Rico in the States as well, and trying to kind of decolonize the journalistic approach of discussing Puerto Rico, especially as I speak Spanish well enough to have a conversation and have a pretty basic interview, but there's things that are going to be lost to me in an English in a purely Spanish interview. So what I guess I'm trying to do is kind of decolonialize the practice of American journalism when it comes to Puerto Rico and allow, the subjects or the subject matter to be the ones who are telling their story, and for me to be merely a vehicle or a vessel to help, translate and not translate, but literally in some cases translate from Spanish to English, but to communicate that story to an audience, mainly in New York and DC and LA and wherever in the States, to an audience who lacks an awareness or lacks an exposure to it. So I think of my work as I approach these subjects and the subject matter as wanting to be a bridge, and allowing these people to tell their own stories and allowing the stories to tell themselves, because there's so much that I don't understand. I understand. I always try to understand well enough to be able, to understand. You have to, in order to respect Puerto Rico, you really have to understand it. So I've done the work. I've spoken to people. I've read the books. I've listened to the podcasts, and I continue. It's all a learning process, and I get things wrong, but I want to be a bridge for the stories that I'm trying to tell and for the people's stories that I'm trying to tell.
I love that. Thank you. So walk me through the process in terms of, you mentioned that you try to build empathy, right? You're trying to build empathy. How do you do that? Are there like practical things, or are there more things that kind of in the moment you kind of spontaneous, or how does your process change in that sense?
A lot of it, I think, is I think a lot of empathy is double-sided. It's experiential. Experience creates empathy, and I also think a lot of it's the way you're brought up, and a lot of it's experiential. So there's a nature and nurture aspect of it, but a lot of it, I think, is a natural compunction, or a natural affinity, or a natural something that lives inside you is just to be empathetic, and it's the way it's so hard to describe.
I know that one was.
It's like,
no, same for me. I feel the same way. How do you build that? I think it is a nature type of thing as well, because I feel like there's some people who just, for whatever reason, you could throw data at them, you could throw stories at them, and they just don't connect.
I think, again, I think it's a natural thing. Having empathy, it comes naturally to a lot of people, and I think it might even be on my website or something, is that like my core principle in my work is a radical sense of empathy. Even empathizing for people I've been doing a lot of this work on Israel and Palestine for a very long time. And I was there after October 7th and witnessed to what's happening in Gaza and witnessed to what happened in Israel on October 7th, and trying to kind of, go between those worlds and understand the immense amounts of suffering that people are going through. And what frustrated me at first was people's lack of empathy in Israel and in Palestine. And what I realized first, within a few days of being there, was that I had to even empathize with somebody's inability to empathize in a given moment. And when, in that case, it's, my house is on fire. I don't have time to worry about the neighbor's house that's also on fire, especially when that person believes that the neighbor set their house on fire. And it was so hard for me, because I approach this work through empathy, and I'm seeing this lack of empathy, and I had to empathize with somebody else's lack of empathy, which was really fucking hard to do.
Yeah. At some point, I want to dive into that, in the psychological understanding of that, because I feel the same way. Sometimes I see such a lack of empathy, and you have to think about like what caused that person to get to that point. Right. That is all part of the ideology, the colonialism, the way we're taught, the suffering that people are going through, kind of like the system shutting down and not being able to handle. So anyway, we'll circle back. But I wanted to just ask you, I think, like, now, talk to me a little bit about what you're covering now, what you want people to kind of pay attention to in terms of, your storytelling here. Yeah,
so I'll talk about first the story that I'm working on as we speak, that I'm going to Culebra in a few hours for. It's a story with NACLA, the North American Congress on Latin America. It's a progressive journal published 4 times a year that focuses on social issues, environmental movements, human rights issues, political issues in Latin America. It's been published for decades, and it does really deep investigative work. And there was a call several months ago for submissions for this upcoming issue on green capitalism in the Americas. And obviously energy issues are a huge issue in Puerto Rico, so it's not an issue that I've looked deeply into in Puerto Rico. So I pitched them the story. Lula, come here, sweetie. I pitched them the story on energy security issues in Puerto Rico, government corruption. It's going to go deeper. And to get back to your point about empathy, this has been talked about a lot on a 30,000-foot policy level with, Promesa and debt restructuring and Genera and Prepa and Luma and Queremos Sol. But those stories don't really have the social impact that they should, because they're so technical and data driven and policy oriented. So when I shared the idea for this story with NACLA and their editors, Sabrina and Julianne, I said, I want to cover this story, and obviously I'll discuss the policy issues in the story, but I want to focus on different kind of case studies from across Puerto Rico, and not just on Puerto Rico, but on Culebra and Vieques too, about how individuals have dealt and the challenges facing energy security issues and energy poverty, and how that affects public health and education and economic issues. So approaching it from a very sociological lens. So I've been going across Puerto Rico over the last few weeks, looking at individual family members, individual families, organizations like Casa Pueblo and Adjuntas, who have taken it upon themselves to support their communities' energy security through sustainable, holistic approaches and projects without external government support. I'm going to Culebra later today to meet with families who are part of a pilot project with the Environmental Defense Fund in Puerto Rico for a community solar project. So the whole goal of my work, the agenda, I try to have no agenda when I approach any work. My only agenda is to create awareness, empathy, and bridges and channels for constructive dialogue and communication. That's the goal with this story. And the New York Times, knowing that I was working on these issues and that I was here on December 31st, I woke up, there was a blackout. It was December 31st. Obviously, people are spending time with their families. You know, they're going to parandas, they're having parties. The whole island, Culebra Vieques, in complete darkness. And I reached out to the New York Times. I just said, hey, FYI, it's 10 o'clock in the morning. The island's been in a blackout for 6 hours. I'd like to share this story. And they said, great, we have a reporter who's working on it. We need you to go around the island, take photos. And they published my photos for that story. And I'd been reaching out to New York Times about a bunch of different stories, the election story, stories about Bad Bunny, Residente, the work that they're doing in Puerto Rico. And yet it fell on deaf ears, but they covered the Apagon story. Luckily, I'm grateful for that. Then they covered the other Apagon story of this past week, and they published my photos for that story, you know, during Semana Santa. So I'm trying to get them to pay attention to more of the work that's happening in Puerto Rico, to also share the work that other photojournalists in Puerto Rico are doing, other writers in Puerto Rico are doing, and I have a whole long laundry list of those photographers and journalists who are doing this work, and I would love to share that list with you as well. Yeah,
I think that's, again, going back to like the erasure. That's why I think sometimes people are like, we're tired of seeing the problems, we're tired of, you know, why are we talking about problems? Why can't we talk about solutions? Why can't we? But I think an aspect of all of this is we have to give visibility to people's stories, because there's ongoing trauma and suffering and issues that need to be captured.
And that's the way, and I think that's what changes people's hearts and minds. And it's where we've always been a visual society, but we've become a hyper visual society where, you know, it took a black man being murdered by police on live camera for us to get out in the streets. We knew that this was happening for years and years, but if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And I'm trying to bring the issues of Puerto Rico to the forefront, to the site, and doing that through not just policy stories, but stories of the people who are fighting, for their lives, quite literally in Puerto Rico, fighting for education, energy security, for the health of their families, for a future where they are the authors of their future, not somebody in Washington, D.C., and not an oversight board of, 6 Americans are deciding their fate. So that's my goal with the work.
I really, truly appreciate that. And I think I want to ask you now, is there a particular shot, that you can remember that really sticks with you? Like, is there or maybe a story behind a shot that really sticks with you? And I know it's a lot.
A shot from Puerto Rico?
Yeah, from things that you've done here. Is there anything that you go back to?
That day, November 3rd, the Alianza rally, it felt like a tidal wave of energy and change. That day, is, with Residente performing, with Bad Bunny performing, with Dalmau speaking, with Nydia Velasquez and AOC giving speeches. Nydia was there in person. AOC sent a recording, just for them to be there. And the photographs I got on that day, there's one photo of Bad Bunny that I went back into the crowd and took a photo, and he kind of looks like this Joan of Arc sort of figure. There's a Puerto Rican flag, and you can kind of see him on stage talking about Puerto Rico's independence. And this was 2 months before his album came out. And there's a crazy story about Pleneros from that day too, that if we have time, I'll tell you. It's a quick story. But that kind of story of that photo of looking at Benito through the crowd with, the flags, the PIP flags flying and the Puerto Rico flags flying, felt like this collective, effervescent energy for something that is going to be a watershed moment that doesn't necessarily create change in the governor's mansion now in Puerto Rico, but it creates an energy and a wave and a snowball of change that's going to alter the course of Puerto Rico's future. And I think, Benito standing on the shoulders of, Renee, and Renee standing on the of Residente, and Residente standing on the shoulders of, the ones who came before him, and the political figures, Albizu Campos and Canales and Lebron and the Young Lords and all the fighters in New York and in the diaspora. And this is the next generation. This is how the social activism is happening in this day and age. So that moment, that photo kind of encapsulated it all for me. And I think when we look back, that day, that moment will probably be a day that, we think about as a moment that kind of catalyzed, galvanized an entire movement for the future.
I was actually in the crowd. So I remember just thinking the same thing. Just that energy was so beautiful, and it felt like there's possibly, but I think, speaking of after the elections and how it felt to see, things kind of, there's a lot of disappointment and anger and people are, but I do see that hope and that, people are inspired to continue pushing.
Definitely. I mean, people didn't give up. People waited. Nobody that I saw that was at that voter registration event left. Nobody got offline. They were there from 8, 10 in the morning until 10, 12 at night. Nobody left. My friend Gabby Santana, who I became friends with during that day, I interviewed her. She waited online for 8 or 9 hours. She had a lot of other shit she could have been doing that day. And a puppy at home. She waited there all day. Another voter who came just from the States to register to vote in Puerto Rico and was voting in her very first Puerto Rican election. She's in her 50s. She came back to Puerto Rico. She wanted to be a part of the change. She waited online for 10 hours that day and registered to vote. And it was the first time she ever voted in an election. She actually felt that her vote counted this time. And I came back for the election day. I was here on election day, and I was going across the island and interviewing and photographing people. And Gabby, actually, same friend, gave me a call and said, hey, I have friends who are volunteering at the Electoral Commission, and their security is forcing out all of the election watchers, the vote counters from the independence-oriented parties. But the PNP and the PNP, their volunteers are allowed to stay. And I went, just flashed my press pass, and I got in and I photographed, and it was literally votes were still coming in, and only the volunteers from the PNP and the PNP were allowed to stay and count the votes. And the volunteers from the other parties, the independence-minded parties, the Alianza, were all college kids who, were there not studying. This is midterms. It's November. Or finals November, and they were there, and I've stayed in touch with a lot of these kids, and they continue to do the work, and they were powerless against a government force that sent the police, that sent security against them, but they haven't given up the fight. And that to me is, if they're not going home, if they're not giving up the fight, I'm not going to give up the fight.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like these next 4 years, waiting for that next wave, I think people are going to be more prepared than ever for the next one. There are people so determined to keep doing the political work. And so anyway, I wanted to ask you, as kind of like one of the final questions here for Americans who are watching this from the States, who are not Puerto Rican, who don't know. Do you have any advice for people who want to get involved, who actually want to figure out ways to help? Because obviously we don't want, it's sort of like that double-edged sword, sometimes well-meaning.
Right.
But what are ways that people help?
I think the first step is self-education. Well, actually, no, before that is self-awareness. As an American voter who can vote in the U.S. general elections, who has representation in Congress, making that an issue that you care about. There are so many issues that we need to be fighting for these days. Add Puerto Rico to the list of issues that you care about, because it should be elevated. It's, I think if so many, progressive Americans knew that they had a role in perpetuating the oldest colony in the world, and they had a part in that relationship, they would take it upon themselves to say, hey, I'm part of the problem, let me be a part of the solution. So recognizing that self-awareness, recognizing that whether we like it or not, we are part of the issue, we are part of the problem. And then self-education. Go out and read Jorel's book. Go read War Against All Puerto Ricans by Nelson Dennis. Listen to the Boricua podcast. Listen to En La Brega podcast. Go read the historical journalism that's been written about Puerto Rico. Read about who the Young Lords are. Read Olga Dies Dreaming. Listen to the music of Los Pleneros de la Cresta and read what the words say. Listen to Benito's albums, read what the words say. Listen to Ios de Cañaveral from Presidente and read what the words say and listen to what they're saying to you. Be a part of the movement. Don't let the movement just exist here. So self-awareness, self-education, and then figure out who are the voices and share those voices. There's a lot of work being done from Puerto Rico, not just, on the, 100 million listener Spotify level, but there's podcasts like yours. There's independent journalists who are doing this sort of work, and hopefully we can link to all of them. There's photographers who are doing this work, who are telling their own stories, who are telling their photography stories. In New York, too. My friend Alexis from the Bronx is telling these stories. My friend Dylan in Brooklyn is telling these stories. My friend Al from Kiosco 787 is telling these stories through food. El Hosco Bravo in Toalta is telling these stories through independence, through agriculture. Bacoa in Juncos is telling these stories through a culinary perspective. It's happening on Vieques, it's happening on Culebra, it's happening everywhere. So when you come to Puerto Rico, When you come to Puerto Rico, get out of San Juan, support local economies across the island, and in doing such, you and Culebra and Vieques, and in that process, you will see one of the most beautiful, magical, most welcoming places, and you will educate yourself in this process as well.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I deeply appreciate anytime I hear someone from this perspective, because I grew up and I was around so much of this sort of, like you said, oh, what's the deal? What's the deal? So hearing somebody and like the fact that you're pushing for this is really appreciated. My final question is always, is there anything I missed that you wanted to share? Is there something, a story? You mentioned Los Pleneros, but is there anything else that you want to share that you feel really you want to put out there for people to listen to?
Man, there's a lot. There's so much from a more macro level when it comes to journalism and documentary photography to Puerto Rico specifically. I think, like, from the American perspective, I think support local independent journalists. I think, and I'm not talking about myself. Obviously, I want you to pay attention to my work. Otherwise, why the fuck would I be doing it? But without hurting my own, potential future relationships with any major media outlet. Most major media outlets now, they look at success through clicks and through engagement, and They're owned by private equity or major corporations. So you have to ask yourself what agenda is being fed to you. What, you know, who is in control of the media that you are consuming. So we all need to do a better job of seeking out truth and facts and opinion from more independent sources who have the capability, like me, to go tell stories that we aren't getting editor telling us what we have to cover, editor telling us, you know, who to speak to or how to speak about certain things, because they have an editor and they have an editor, and that editor has a board of directors who they are getting direction from. So in Puerto Rico, you know, there's my work, there's Bianca Gralao, there's Molusco, there's Jay Fonseca, there's you, there's a million independent, not a million, Ricardo Ardueno, there's independent journalists and artists who are doing this sort of work who you should be paying attention to. Trying to empathize, understanding your role in perpetuating negativity in your own community, and figuring out how you can be a force for positive change, because it is actually possible. I think what the government now in the States is doing is trying to batter us into submission and to make us scared of speaking up, to make us scared of protesting, to make us scared of sharing our opinions. And that just makes it more important to do all of those things, because if they batter us into submission, we're going to lose all of our rights and freedoms to be able to do those sorts of things. And also engage with people who you disagree with. More than anything, stop just staying within communities of people who you agree with. Get out and have healthy disagreements. Get out and have dialogue. Don't be afraid to have a conversation, to get a coffee, to go have a beer with somebody who you know voted for the opposite party, for somebody who you know disagrees with you fundamentally on issues, because you will understand your own positions better. You will understand the opposing position. You will be able to empathize better. And these people, we all want the same things. We want health, we want security, we want self-determination, we want freedom over our own lives. Other people just have different routes for how and why they want to get to that point. But try to understand the opposing viewpoint. Anytime you have a viewpoint, you should take it upon yourself to understand the opposing viewpoint.
Yes. And just to speak to that, I remember a few conversations I had, especially right after, where people were saying, I think that the way, you know, organizers were saying this, the way is to go door to door in your neighborhood and have those conversations with people one by one. Yeah. Because face to face is the only way you're going to...
Totally. Not online. I mean, you can have these conversations online too, but as long as it's healthy and proactive. And that story about Planeros, that I think because the story, why I want to tell it is because the story is still unfolding. So that day, November 3rd, when there was the Alianza rally in San Juan at the convention center, there was a number of bands performing all day long. It was from like 3 p.m. until like midnight. I was fucking exhausted. It was like 10 or 11 at night. I was dripping sweat. I hadn't eaten. Lula, my dog, was at home. I needed to get back to her. And I was just like sitting there, probably drinking a Gatorade or a Medalla, something to refresh myself, about to go. Somebody comes up to me and says, "Hey, are you a photographer?" And I'm like covered in cameras. And I'm like, okay, yeah, what gave it away? And most of the other photographers had left at that point. Somebody comes up to me and says, you know, I'm working with this band, this group. They're about to, you know, play in a couple sets. I think...
Sorry, you didn't know anything about them before?
No, nothing. And I was covering this from like a news perspective for a story about like, you know, the election seasons in America's forgotten colony. That was my news. That was my piece that I self-published, that I wrote, that no news outlet wanted to. And I haven't even published it myself. I wrote it. I did the photos, everything. I haven't even put it online yet because I think it's still unfolding. It's probably ready to go now. But Ile was performing, who I was going to stay for and just watch Ile perform. I love her music. She sings about a lot of the subject matter that I'm interested in as well. And somebody came up to me and said, hey, could you just do us a favor? We have this band. They came from Ciales. They're going to perform. They're one of the last acts of the night. We don't have a photographer, and we'd really love to document this. I said, yeah, sure, why not? Of course, I'm happy to help. I had no idea who they were. I met the guys, these 4 guys, 3 brothers and their friend Josue. Their manager, Vivi, said, thank you so much. Their set's going to be like 20 minutes, and these, I don't know the names of them, but these people on stilts, I don't know if you stayed for this, are going to come and walk around on stage like gigantes, and they're going to come and walk around, and it's going to be like one of the closing acts of the night. So I get on stage with them. It's Los Pleneros de la Cresta. They started 2013 at La Yupi. They sing really traditional plena music, Puerto Rican plena music. They're kind of, 4 young guys in their 20s and 30s elevating this old school Caribbean, Afro-Puerto Rican art form. And I shot the show. I sent them the photos. They posted the photos. They were super grateful towards me. I was really happy to do it. Their music was great. I'm happy I stayed. And then a few months later, when I was back here, Bad Bunny's album comes out, and they're on like 3 of the songs. And then their manager reaches out to me, hey, are you here? We need a photographer. We're doing this other event, which was the concert in Rio Piedras. The day that he released the album, Bad Bunny just said, hey, I'm going to be at El Boricua, 8 o'clock. So I was in Humacao. I got my car. I drove as fast as I could. Vivi and Gabby, their managers, and Ale Pavon got me a backstage pass. I photographed that show, and they told me the story of how on that day, November 3rd, Bad Bunny had performed like in the middle of the afternoon. He was obviously one of the primary acts, but he had either come back or stayed for their show, and they met Benito after the show. The guys from Pleneros met Benito after the show. Benito, wrapped them up, said, hey, I really love your music. Keep doing what you're doing. And they said to him as a joke, we're here. We're always around if you ever want to collaborate. And this was in November. And Benito said, exactly. And Benito, as a joke, tongue in cheek, and Benito said to them, wait, I didn't realize you already knew. And they said, no, what? And Benito's like, espérate. And he takes out his phone and he shows them a set list, a song list for his upcoming album. Before the album, he goes, oh, I thought somebody had told you already. I came up, these are the songs for the album. Nothing's complete, but I have you guys on like 3 songs. I want to work with you guys on like 3 songs. And they're like, no fucking way, stop. And he's like, yeah, I thought because you said, let's work together, somebody must have told you already. And they said, no, nobody's mentioned it to us. So 2 months later, they're recording, 3 or 4 songs, Cafe Comunion, Baile Inolvidable. They're in the video. They did the song for the BCN. And they're going to be at the residency. They're going to New York. They're performing at Toñitas with Bad Bunny. And their music, when you listen to it, is all about social change and social justice and history in Puerto Rico. And their music is still about that. The new music that they're making is still all about that. And the day after that album came out, January 6th, January 5th, they're in Rio Piedras doing the free concert. They're blowing up, getting notoriety all over the world. They go back to Ciales and they take the money that they had made from this album release and they open up a community arts center in Ciales called, I think it's called Casa Yerba Bruja, which is one of their songs. And I think they got a 20-year lease from the mayor to develop arts and community programs for kids in their hometown. So that's when Puerto Ricans are successful and care, they come back and they give back to their community. And you see that with every major artist in Puerto Rico. They go, they might leave, they might make money somewhere else, but they come home and they give it back to their community.
Thank you so much. That's such a beautiful story. I love that. It's sad. I'm sad to end this interview because I feel like we have so many more topics we could cover, but I just want to say thank you. And I also want to ask, where can people find you? Where? Yeah.
I'm www. Should I look at the camera and tell them? www.jesse-kornbluth.com. Jesse is spelled Jesse dash just one dash. Kornbluth is spelled the traditional way, but I'll spell it for you. KORNBLUTH.com. Instagram is Kornbluth. KORNBLUTH. Yeah, that's all I got. Can I introduce everybody to my dog? Lula, come here. I want to introduce my photo assistant. My emotional support blanket. This is Lula. Lula's been coming here for 12 years too. She's a Dalma Sata. It's her birthday on May 5th. She'll be 12. Yeah, she's been with me everywhere in Puerto Rico. Every news story I've done, she's always with me. Yeah. She was with me on the election day and everything. Yeah.
Thanks again. I'm so happy. Hopefully we can do another one of these soon.
Yeah.
Cuídate. Gracias. Thanks everyone for watching.